Suspension system. Hello and welcome to this session on suspension system. In this session, we will learn about the purpose of a suspension system, its parts, functions, and types. Motorcycles are designed keeping in mind the discomforts that might be faced while riding on irregular surfaces. Front and rear suspension together forms the suspension system that absorbs vibrations on the wheels. The suspension provides better handling, braking, riding comfort, and safety. The main components of a suspension system are suspension springs and shock absorbers. Suspension spring is a mechanical device typically used to store energy and subsequently release it to absorb shock. The shock absorbers are the most important part of the suspension system. They connect both wheels to the frame and minimize the amount of shock being transmitted to the frame while riding. They are present in both front and rear suspension. The shock absorber consists of a piston rod, pressure valves, hydraulic oil, inner tube, and outer tube. Though the shock absorbers in both the front and rear suspension are similar, there are some differences in their construction. The front suspension has an upper fork and a lower fork that fits into each other like a telescope. The shock absorbers are fixed inside these forks. The front suspension uses an internal coil spring inside the shock absorbers. In the case of the rear suspension, a coil over spring is used on the shock absorber. Coil over springs can support higher load distribution on the rear wheels. One end of the rear suspension is connected to a rectangle frame called the swing arm. The bearings at both ends hold the rear suspension in place between rear wheel and swing arm. Now that you are familiar with the parts, let's see how the parts function together as a system. The suspension spring, when compressed or extends, starts an oscillating motion up and down. Shock absorbers help slow down the oscillation of the suspension springs and reduce the vibratory motion. It turns the kinetic energy of suspension movement into heat energy. To dampen the springs, the shock absorbers goes through two cycles, namely compression cycle and extension cycle. In the compression cycle, when the spring is pressed, the piston is pushed into the inner tube and oil flows up through the pressure valve on the piston. Oil also flows into the second tube through the pressure valve below the tube. The pressure valves are designed to control the flow of oil. Friction is created while flowing through the valve, thus absorbing shock from the spring. Nitrogen in the second tube avoids the foaming in the oil while it is moving. After compression, when the spring expands, extension cycle begins. Here, the oil flows back from the outer tube into the inner tube. The spring expands at a slower rate because of the resistance created by the hydraulic oil, thus absorbing the shock from the rebound. The shock absorbers in the front and rear suspension works with the same principles of extension and compression cycle while going through irregular surfaces. In the case of the front suspension, the forks have internal coil springs used in the shock absorbers. Here the spring is fixed around the piston. In the case of the rear suspension, the swing arm works like our elbow joint. It is used to hold the rear axle firmly to pivot vertically, allowing the suspension to absorb bumps in the road. The rear suspension uses a coil over spring over the shock absorbers. The two main types of rear suspension are monoshock and dual shock. A dual shock is conventionally used in motorcycles and has two shock absorbers. The dual shock gives good support to hold the bike load. A monoshock has only one shock absorber and is fixed under the seat. Such shock absorbers allow better handling and cornering. With that, we have come to the end of this session. In this session, we have learned the purpose of the suspension system is to provide safety and comfort while riding. The main components of the suspension system are suspension spring and shock absorbers. The shock absorber consists of a piston, piston rod, pressure valves, hydraulic oil, inner tube and outer tube. The front suspension uses an internal coil spring and the rear suspension uses a coil-over spring. For providing suspension to the motorcycle, the shock absorbers go through compression and extension cycle to dampen the spring's oscillation. The two types of rear suspension are monoshock and dual shock.